Hello again. This time I'm welcomed by a lot of awesome maintainers. We have James Munnelly, Richard Wall, which you saw before, and Josh again. Guys, do you mind introducing yourself for a second? James, you go first.
Yeah. Hey everyone. I'm James Munnelly. So I started the Cert-manager project about 3 years ago or so now, whilst I was working at Jetstack. And yeah, I'm here to answer any questions you've got.
Thank you. Richard.
Well, hello again. Yeah, Richard Wall, and I've been at Jetstack for about 4 years, I think, working on various operators for Cassandra databases and etcd databases, and now most recently I've joined the Cert-manager team, helping James and Josh.
Thank you.
And Maartje, sorry.
Oh, and Jake, don't forget Jake.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Josh. So I'm a customer reliability engineer at Jetstack. Been at Jetstack for about 3 years, or over 3 years. One of the years as an intern, the rest full time. Worked quite a few things at Jetstack, so Tarmac way back in the day, Cube proxy, version checker, and yeah, of course, Cert-manager, and bits around Cert-manager like the CSI driver and things like that. Probably forgetting some things, but yeah. Maartje?
I already introduced yourself at the beginning, but those who missed that part. Hi, I'm Maartje. I'm working full-time at I'm working 80% at Jetstack, on the Cert-manager team, and for 20% I am also a teacher. I actually have way too many jobs, but the one I like most is working as Cert-manager. So I already got one question from the chat room is, where do I find that music? Which I think is a question for me. So this is all royalty-free music that you can find in the YouTube room, the royalty-free music library. If you Google that, you will find it. It's all open source. Okay, thank you. So I already have a question for you all, which I am afraid to ask. What is your favorite page of RFC 8555?
I have to ask you to give me a reference on them, because I think you've got the whole RFC printed out, right? And bound.
I have it. It's over there in the corner.
Oh.
Okay, serious question now. This is one for you, James, specifically. Why did you start Cert-manager in the first place?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think it was kind of a combination of things. So as Matt mentioned in his kind of intro earlier today, there was actually a precursor to Cert-manager, which was kube-lego. Some of you may have used it or heard of it at least. It was very focused on Let's Encrypt at the time. The actual name of the project comes from, like the Lego part, comes from the name of an Acme library that it used to use under the hood. And that was started by Christian Simon, who previously worked at Jetstack with me as well. And it, again, was a very, very popular project. As Maartje said, Let's Encrypt was kind of the origins of all of this, certainly, and it's kind of one of the biggest use cases of it still today. And I think at a similar time, I was also looking into building something similar to kube-lego, because Let's Encrypt had come about. I heard about it, and was getting fed up of finding certificate services where you could get certificates for free. I remember there was one, I can't remember what it's called now. It had a pretty janky user interface, and I had to authenticate with client certificates.
Didn't it happen to be Start SSL?
I think it was, yeah. Yeah, so I was very excited as well about Let's Encrypt, and it was at the same time as I was getting started with Kubernetes, and third-party resources kind of came about. So after kube-lego was started, I soon after that joined Jetstack as well, and kind of at the same time third-party resources came about, and I started to think, well, we could kind of reinvent some of this around third-party resources. So if you go back to the very first commit in Cert-manager now, you'll see that the certificate resource that you're probably all used to today actually explicitly calls out Acme configuration, and that that actually stuck with the project until I think 0.11, and that was what most people know today as the V1 Alpha 1 API, where you'd specify certificate.spec.acme. And so even Cert-manager was rooted in Let's Encrypt. But I think, I haven't actually looked it up, but a few commits later, we introduced the issuer resource, and it started to become apparent that you know, there is more out there, first of all, than Let's Encrypt, but then also there's actually a lot of, like even with kubelego, people were configuring staging deployments of kubelego that pointed at the staging Acme instance and then having to upgrade or switch over to the production endpoint. And that was definitely a pain point for users. And so the idea of being able to actually manage an Acme account with an issuer sort of came about there. So yeah, from a technical perspective, I think that's kind of where Cert-manager came from. But in terms of like what actually gave me the idea, I've got a server running at home and honestly wanted to get certificates for it there. Through engagements with customers, though, we're also seeing lots of people obviously need to manage TLS certificates. It's a common foundation of identity and all sorts. So yeah, I mean, I guess that's where it came about from. Just a need to sort of manage this in an automated way. CRDs came about after that, and that was kind of a big upgrade. And you could see really that the extensions to Kubernetes, that whole ecosystem, is really developing and had a lot of potential. So yeah, I don't know if Richard or Josh, I mean, you've been around, you've seen a lot of the project as well. I don't know if you've got any thoughts. Or Maartje.
Well, I've only just joined the project, but I wanted to, you were talking about, James, you were saying third-party resources. So that was the old name for custom resources, wasn't it?
Yeah. So that was kind of the first revision of it, and it didn't have anything fancy that we see today. I think it predated validating and mutating webhooks, certainly conversion. It didn't have schemas.
So it's been interesting to see like how we've been using those from the get-go, and how that system has advanced, and how, well, you're sort of really in touch with the developers of that mechanism, right? And we've sort of been at the forefront of webhooks and conversions and such.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you that we're on the forefront of like adopting these things. And I think that's kind of partly been like where we've had troubles with upgrades, and where we've had troubles along the way. Just generally, like I feel like we've run into a lot of problems and had to report a lot of problems to the upstream projects, and that certainly helped to shape how the feature, like how it's all come about today. So it's certainly not been without its challenges. I think we'd all agree.
Okay, so next question. So this time not for James, but for Richard, Josh, and well, probably I. So let's start with Richard's. How did you get involved in the Cert-manager project? When did you first hear about it? Why did you join it?
Well, I first heard about it when I joined Jetstack. I mean, I think it was at the time. Well, no, when I first joined Jetstack, there was kubelego, and that apparently was written by Christian as part of his interview for Jetstack. Then I think I've been sort of helping out here and there with Cert-manager since the beginning, since James created this successor to kubelego, Cert-manager. But I've only just been involved very heavily in the project in the last 6 months. But it's really fun. It's fun to be involved in. I have never. Well, I was involved in the Navigator project, which predated controller runtime and operator SDK. And in Navigator was an operator for managing multiple types of database in Kubernetes, and it was maybe ahead of its time. But James and I worked on that, and James brought a lot of his experience of Cert-manager to Navigator. I think I might be going off topic, but I remember it being hell of a lot of work to write the reconcilers and the controllers from scratch. So it's very interesting to join Cert-manager now, having written a few controller runtime based operators, and see Cert-manager, because of its age, still has a lot of code written without controller runtime, and it'll be interesting for me to see how we can start to adopt controller runtime more in Cert-manager. I mean, I might be jumping the gun a bit. This may not be on the roadmap, but that's what I'm quite interested in seeing.
Josh, what do you think? Well, why you joined?
Yeah, sure. So, like I said, I joined Jetstack a number of years ago as an intern. So it was a summer internship at university, and then I stayed on part-time during my final year. And during that time, I was working quite a bit on internal tooling at Jetstack, sort of automating some admin stuff and things like that, as well as helping out with the Tarmac project. So that was a Kubernetes provisioner for AWS, with dreams of it being sort of agnostic to any cloud provider. That ended up getting sunsetted. So the kind of natural progression was, hey, we have the Cert-manager thing. I think it's quite good. Yeah, why don't you work on it? And no, yeah, it was great. I think that was definitely over 2 years ago, maybe. I'm not sure about the timelines, but maybe not that long. I'm not sure. But yeah, no, that's kind of how I got involved in the project. And at that time, it was just me and James. I remember having stand-ups marked for 15 minutes, turning into, at some point, 2 hours, and having lots of in-depth conversations about a single field on a certificate resource, and yeah, having debates on where to put things and things like that. But so yeah, that's how I got involved in the project, and obviously starting out small, as you do, and then eventually progressing on to doing things like introducing the certificate request resource. This was back when we even then had kind of intent to integrate with things like Istio, and it became clear that the certificate request back then, which was doing both the X509 certificate like templating, requesting, generating the CSR, and then going ahead and sending it off to the issuer, etc. That was all kind of happening transparently in this kind of one resource, and it was the kind of Istio integration that really kickstarted the kind of separation of the concept of having a separate certificate request resource that was kind of reconciled separately. But yeah, perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself. But yeah, that's how I got introduced to the project, and yeah, where we are today.
I'd say a massive shout out to Josh for that work on the certificate request, because I think that's been quite instrumental, not only in integrating with other projects like Istio or whatever else, but actually being able to enable other people, other companies to go and build their own integration with their own certificate management platforms or whatever issuers and CAs they've got internally, which I think has been pretty huge.
It's a pretty important part of Cert-manager. To answer the question myself also, I've been using Cert-manager for a long time. I even used kubelego in my previous job and on my own clusters, and I just loved it. I already had like a pre-lab for Let's Encrypt and how they worked. And then when I got fired from my last job because they went bankrupt, then suddenly Matt Bates came to me on Twitter and said, "Hi, we're hiring on Jetstack for the Cert-manager team." And I was like, Cert-manager? That's amazing. So yeah, that's how I actually came here via a stupid tweet, and I've been here for 9 months now, I just noticed, and never been happier since. So I have a question which was asked also in the Slack, but also today in YouTube. So, do you use Cert-manager yourself? If so, what do you use it for, and how do you install it? Let's start with James.
Yeah, so I do use Cert-manager myself. I think my server has probably been one of the first ones to install all of the dodgy updates that may have come through over the years. And yeah, the loss of service on some of my own services probably have caught a few things and triggered a prompt patch release after the .0 patch release after a new minor. I have gone through various different ways of installing it. So I think for a while I have used Helm. For a while after that, I've switched over to kubectl. There's always been, like, I'm particularly careful around how I manage the rollout of CRDs, and then nowadays kind of webhooks too, which came up recently before upgrading the controllers. So I kind of liked for a while to have a bit more control in just using kubectl. I think, as one of your other questions, I think this is from Leonard, has brought up around kind of Helm and the handling of CRDs there. That's kind of part of the reason why I did switch over to using kubectl to manage it, or to manage the CRDs specifically. I now actually use Google's Anthos config management project to manage my installation. I still separately install the CRD resources though myself using kubectl, just because I think in a lot of GitOps controllers right now, there's not any special management or complex management for CRDs and the way they get installed. I think it's a problem space ripe for some work is kind of like life cycle management of extensions to Kubernetes APIs. I've got a whole load of opinions that maybe we'll have a separate question for coming up. But yeah, anyone else? How do you use Cert-manager?
Who is you? Richard.
Well, I don't use it in my hobby time, but I use it every time I deploy a controller runtime project. It's kind of bundled in to their customized scripts, and you uncomment one or two parts of the customized templates that they provide, and it takes care of I beg your pardon, it doesn't actually take care of installing Cert-manager, but it does then make use of Cert-manager resources. So it's always been installing Cert-manager for me has just been using Customize and kubectl to install the Cert-manager full manifest, which includes the CRDs. And I was recently investigating a problem reported by one of our users, someone who was using a tool called Flux, which James Munnelly helped me a little bit with. It's somewhat similar to Anthos, I think. So that's one that I am going to be investigating shortly, because we got to the bottom of that person's problem, and it wasn't to do with Flux, but it's made me think that we ought to improve our documentation for those people installing Cert-manager using GitOps style systems.
Just, Richard, you kind of almost reminded me to maybe expand on some of the specific use cases of like how I use it as well. So yeah, I use Let's Encrypt, and I also manage my own internal CA, which I have scripts kind of like push those off to my network switch even. I kind of got a bit ahead of myself with the internal networking and registered a .dev domain name, which unfortunately sets a, what's it called, record. The type of record that forces you to use TLS on every single domain name, which means that my network switch, my access points, like everything with an admin interface now needs a certificate. So I've kind of forced myself to use my Kubernetes master for that. HSTS, yeah, that's it. Yeah, so that's another way I use Cert-manager, and yeah. Sorry, jumping in there.
No worries. Josh, do you have any switches running Cert-manager?
I can't say I do. I'd say yeah, I'm saying it's Richard. A lot of my hobby projects aren't necessarily TLS dependent, but indeed during my kind of day-to-day work, if it's obviously not Cert-manager specific, okay, customers and things like that, that's obviously dependent on what the customer is using. But indeed, myself, if I'm doing some development work and not necessarily even Cert-manager, I think the first two lines of bash I'm doing is kind of create cluster and then kubectl apply https // etc. etc. So yeah, that's the way I kind of using it with kubectl, and then indeed it will be internal PKI typically for what I'm using it for. And usually the kind of self-sign trick you can do by creating a self-signed issuer which backs a C8 issuer, which is, I was quite a big smile on my face when I discovered that. Yeah, I think that's me really.
Thank you. So yeah,
Can I ask?
sorry.
I was just going to ask. So James, that setup where you're using Cert-manager to create certificates for your switches and home network, is that? You should blog about that. It'd be quite interesting to read more about it.
Yeah, I may do it at some
Not
point.
making more work for you, but
Yeah, I may do it at some point. Yeah, I also was thinking. I'm trying to remember now. There's something. I've got a thing that plugs into my WireGuard network as well. So,
right.
Yeah, there's a few different places. I think they're still using the old certificates API, not certificate requests directly, though.
Right.
So, how about you, Maartje?
So I use it mostly to run my home Kubernetes cluster, which is sitting right over there in the rack. It's on screen. What I run on there is I once written, when I was younger, about 2 years ago, I've written my own platform as a service, which has exactly one customer, and I only want exactly one customer on there, which is me. So I made this to make all my personal projects easily hostable. And that's all Cert-manager powered. It mostly runs Cert-manager for the external endpoint certificates using Let's Encrypt. And I think I also have a few internal ones in there, but nothing as fancy as switches yet.
Say fancy. I wouldn't say it's a good thing that I have to write all this extra bash. So honestly, it's a symptom of HSTS.
I do want to use it to connect my network to the edu-roam network and have edu-roam at home.
Petition Cisco to get native support.
I know people at Cisco. Let's start emailing. So, question, James. You often in meetings tell, sorry for the confusing name Cert-manager, while we all think it's a good name, but you often say that you hate it. So what would you like to rather name Cert-manager 3 years later?
So, like you say, I hate it. I think it's grown on me, especially after we were talking about this earlier too. The one thing about a pragmatic name, like an actual descriptive name, is like no one doesn't know that Cert-manager manages certs. It is clear what it does from the name. I think like a marketing name is good. Maybe we should have, like if at the time of it being created, Jetstack actually had a marketing department, like of any significant size, someone would have stopped me before I put it out there. But I think Matt at the time at least always said, I don't know if he probably would stick with it now. I think he likes it. But he always said that he wanted it to be, not something controlled just by the company and whatever else. So I think it's, I think it's probably grown on me. And also, don't ask me if you're going to rename it. Do not ask me again. I've already said I'm not allowed in those conversations. So I'm not even going to pass an opinion or a judgment. What would you name it?
I'm not great at those things either.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna combine a few questions in like a more generic one because we only have 10 minutes left. Where do you see the future of Cert-manager? Where do you see us going? And I think that's more individual for everybody here. So James, where do you see it going?
I mean, I also want to allow some time for everyone else to speak. So I think, for me at least, I'll focus on one thing, which I think is the project kind of moving away from being just a single project to being more of like an actual ecosystem around it. So us separating out the ideas of like API definitions, but with certificate request coming along, and then actually being able to break apart even our issuer implementation. So Richard mentioned like the Signer Benify. There's also Signer CA. And I imagine like once we get, I think the intention is once we get to that point, having like Signer Acme again, and then almost having Cert-manager as the umbrella that weaves these bits together. Which, to me, seems like a good way for us to, first of all, introduce some kind of like discipline around different bits, but also make sure that we're not like siloing those out of tree issue implementations, and making sure that we're not kind of special casing like the internal use cases, and actually kind of supporting the community to build what they need around it too. But I'm keen to hear what anyone else has got in terms of what they think.
Richard.
Well, we are talking, aren't we, about making use of that Kubernetes certificates API more and more. In particular, the Kubernetes CSR type. We can't replace the certificate request in Cert-manager yet, because the CSR type isn't the V1 version of the CSR type isn't widely available, isn't widely used well, people aren't using modern enough Kubernetes clusters for us to be able to use that. But Cert-manager, an option for Cert-manager to be able to use that API rather than its built-in certificate requests might be something we start planning for. And also what I said before, I mean, I suppose I would quite like to investigate which parts of which controllers in Cert-manager might be usefully re-implemented using controller runtime, and as following on from what James said, maybe broken out into separate components at the same time. And then we should say we've got quite a lot of plans for enterprise features, haven't we, around Cert-manager? But that's a separate discussion.
Josh.
Yeah, I think for me, I think I mentioned it earlier in my talk earlier. I think the kind of ingress use case, I guess, it is like a fairly solved problem. I think that's quite stable, and it's clearly widely used, and people are happy with it. It is the areas around securing, Kubernetes control plane components themselves, or indeed internal PKI with service mesh, which I think is interested going into the future, and also things I'd like to see that are kind of adjacent to this space. That are things like certificate policy, for example, which make these features more viable or kind of more acceptable in those kind of spaces. So yeah, that's what I'm kind of interested to see where the project goes in the future. And yeah, with the certificates API especially, the upstream one, I think we're well placed for that.
Yeah, because we've talked about that policy being, maybe that's hooked into the approval process of the certificates.
Indeed, yeah. I think the main bit is around the identity of the requester. So the Kubernetes API server enforces the identity of the request when it's created on the status, which we can rely on. But if you take in the case of our internal certificate request resource, the only way to get that reliably is through the webhook. It's extra hops, and yeah, it's obviously a cleaner implementation to leave that certificate request resource, certificate signing request. Yeah, I guess implementation details, but yeah. I'm
excited to see what more comes of things like that user info block, because I think it's quite a powerful and essential piece, really, and it will enable a lot of policy control and much more advanced much more advanced systems to kind of integrate where they do require that sort of thing.
I'm gonna try to answer mine quickly because we only have 4 minutes left. So I'm gonna go like technical. These guys nailed it, like everything I think about Cert-manager. But I'm thinking more general Kubernetes. Right now, most Kubernetes services communicate over plain protocols inside the cluster because we see this cluster as being a trusted bubble. But I think that with marketing term would be zero trust there, to have every single Kubernetes server internally fully talking over an internal TLS connection with an internal PKI, with an internal OCSP server to 100% guarantee end-to-end that nobody's even inside your cluster can talk to your service without having a valid certificate. So I'm going to take one more question because we're running out of time and our next speaker is waiting. And this is actually a question from our next speaker. So, are there any stability guarantees for client Go versions used with the future Cert-manager versions?
So, I don't mind jumping in and talking about that.
There you go for it, James.
So, yes, that's kind of exactly what I think the V1 release, the V1 API actually kind of says. So with that, if you're depending on the V1 endpoint in like the Kubernetes REST API, you can be sure that you can always submit resources of a particular form that works today to that endpoint, and it will continue to work. That doesn't mean that when V2 comes along, you can just blindly change to using V2 with those same resources. But it does mean that you can like continue to use V1 and migrate to V2 as and when you're ready, in a similar way that we've had with V1 Beta 1 to V1. In terms of like the client Go packages, I think that's actually a bit of a tricky one because of the way code generation works in client Go with the code generator project. The actual, in terms of Golang compatibility, I think they don't make a strong promise about not potentially breaking that. So you could have a function name change or something similar. What I'd advise if you are depending on client Go and code generator is potentially, and you don't want to have that issue coming up, which usually is quite minor when it does happen, is to generate the like PKG client directory yourself using code generator and whatever version of like the Kubernetes dependencies that you're already using. Alternatively, the controller runtime project has the generic client in there, which actually works really well, and it will save you having to depend, well, it will save you being locked to Cert-manager's version of the Kubernetes dependencies. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. It's a complex topic. It's difficult to sum up in what I think is probably about 30 seconds. I know I'm going to be rushed off the stage, but yeah, happy to chat as well a little bit more on the Slack and maybe put together a documentation page on exactly what this means. But you can be rest assured that there's not going to be big issues or any like wire protocol changes that might affect you.
Thank you. And actually, a self-correction here. I was wrong. The next speaker is Josh. We still have one talk in between. I was running ahead of schedule. So thank you very much, everybody. I think we still have so many questions left. I think this calls out for Community Day 2. Do you think?
Yeah, definitely up for that. And I'll try and answer, if there's any more of these questions that we haven't answered, maybe we can move them into the Slack channel and kind of answer them in threads there or something.
Great idea. So you can find us on the Kubernetes Slack in hashtag Cert-manager. So thank you very much, and we'll see you in a minute for Josh again.
Thank you.
Bye.